Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our first Feminist Research Alliance event of the academic year. And I'm delighted to introduce Rebecca Borowski, who is in her final year as a PhD candidate in higher ed administration in the ELP, or Educational Leadership and Policy Department. And she anticipates defending her dissertation during the spring semester. For the past few years, she's worked as a graduate assistant in the C-STEP office on campus, and she's helped talented underrepresented students prepare for graduate school and careers in STEM and the licensed professions. Rebecca has served on the UB Women in STEM Cooperative Steering Committee for the past 5 years, and on the Social Media Committee and the annual UB Women in STEM Summit Committee as well. So a very good citizen for the Gender Institute and all of its related events. She's participated in the UB Gender Institute's dissertation writing group over the past 4 years and attended the Feminist Research Alliance luncheons and other events. Her career goal is to work on strategic planning and implementation of diversity and inclusion initiatives in higher ed. And Rebecca's dissertation examines gendered experiences of women leaders in STEM fields in higher ed and how those experiences influence their leadership. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca to the Gender Institute.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I've had imposter syndrome all week, being nervous about this, but I'm ready to go. So this is my dissertation topic, Women Leaders in STEM Disciplines, a Comparative Case Study on Leadership and Disciplinary Culture. And I'm going to get right into it. So this is a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll have some introductory literature, purpose of the study and research questions. I'll briefly go over my theoretical framework and then return to that at the end. Methodology, findings, application of theory, and a conclusion. And I have some recommendations for policy and practice in future research at the end as well. So why study women's leadership in STEM? Women are still underrepresented as leaders in higher education. Only 27% of deans and department heads in STEM are women, and about that same number, 25% of full-time faculty in senior positions in STEM are women. So there's still a far way to go to achieve equity. There are barriers that women face, include sexual harassment, chilly climate, stereotype threat, lack of women role models, inequities in pay, fewer opportunities for advancement. Those are just some of the barriers. And then some other things that women face in masculinist cultures are stereotype threat, which is expectations for women's behavior that cause them to underperform. So if they're expected to not be good in math and then they feel like they aren't good enough, that influences their perception of themselves. And then also imposter syndrome, which is similar, the feeling of feeling inadequate or not belonging because of your identity, which causes you to doubt your accomplishments and be less confident. So those are some things that women face, and when they have lower self-efficacy, they tend to self-select out of STEM. So I'm also looking at disciplinary norms and expectations. In male-dominated disciplines, the experiences are shaped by men, and there's little research on how leadership identity affects persistence of women in STEM. So there is literature on women's leadership in other male-dominated domains, such as management or business and law, but as far as leadership in STEM for women, that there is not a lot of literature, so that's what my dissertation is focusing on and filling that gap. So a masculinist culture is one that favors men and puts women at a disadvantage, and it is based on male norms and expectations. So that could include adversarial language, masculine styles of communication that are aggressive or competitive, focus on acquiring status. It could also include sexual harassment. And then also it is based on male norms and behaviors. So men are seen as more credible than women often, and women have to work harder to achieve the same credit. And then women also adopt masculine language and behavior in order to appear more credible. So they want to be seen as one of the guys. So moving on to the purpose of this study is to compare gendered leadership expectations between two disciplines, biology and engineering. Biology is female dominated in terms of undergraduates and students, and engineering is male dominated. So in doing so, I hope to address how gendered leadership experiences in this masculinist culture shape women's leadership styles. I focused on two subdisciplines of engineering just to narrow the scope of the study. I looked at mechanical engineers and computer science engineers. These have been found to be least welcoming to women. They award less than 20% of bachelor's degrees to women engineers. Both are male-dominated, machine-fixated cultures that value solitary work as well as group culture. So I specifically looked at those for engineering. So here are my 4 research questions that I look at in this study. The first one is, what do STEM women leaders identify as attributes of a good leader? How do STEM women leaders navigate the leadership expectations of their discipline? How do gendered experiences inform women leaders' leadership expectations? And how do disciplinary differences shape women leaders' leadership expectations in STEM? So the theory that I use is Joan Acker's theory of gendered organizations, and she was a sociologist who worked at the University of Oregon, starting in 1967, and she founded the Center of Study for Women in Society. So she passed away 3 years ago at the age of 92, but her work that I use the most is Hierarchies, Jobs, Bodies, a theory of gendered organizations, and that's from 1990. That's her article from 1990. So this theory has been used in higher education. My advisor, Dr. Salih, has used it in her work on faculty fathers, along with others that have used it for faculty peer networks, experiences of women faculty over their careers, and sports leadership in higher education. So it's been applied in higher education, but not always, the whole theory has not always been used. Parts of it have been used. So I'm hoping to add to that body of literature and have a more complete analysis using the theory. So the theory basically says that gender inequality is maintained through the organization. It is reproduced in organizations. So organizations are not gender neutral, but they often are masked as being gender neutral. Advantage and disadvantage are framed in gendered terms, and men's opportunities depend on women's denial of opportunities. So this could be disparities in pay or hierarchy. Those are some examples. So the theory has 5 different processes in which organizations are gendered. So the maintenance of gendered divisions, those divisions are represented in symbols and images in the organization. And there are interactions between men and women that produce gendered social structures. And those interactions then inform the gendered individual identity of the women. So it's kind of a process that each process builds on the next one, and those interactions shape the identity, and then the final process is the creation of organizational logic. So those are the underlying assumptions in work organizations. So I'm going to return to this theory at the end, and I'm going to apply it to one of my research questions, not all of them, because there won't be time probably, but I'll go through it and give some examples of those processes. So in turning to the methodology that I used for this study, I used a qualitative research design, which is naturalistic and a study of culture. So I thought that would be appropriate because I'm studying disciplinary culture of organizations. I use a case study design, which is a bounded system with definable boundaries using multiple sources of data. So this specific case study is a single embedded case study. That means there's 2 units of analysis embedded in a single context. So the 2 units of analysis are women in engineering, women in biology. They're embedded within the context of academia. So that's how I framed that study. Site selection. I drew participants from biology and engineering departments from 115 doctoral granting 4-year institutions with highest research activity. I picked these because these universities have the highest rate of departure for non-retirement faculty. They're more hostile to women faculty, providing women with fewer opportunities and limited support, and they can have a chilly climate which affects women faculty. So I sent out lots of recruitment emails. I did put the number in here, but I probably will not put that in my final presentation. I contacted 240 women leaders. I did rounds of like 20 people that I sent out at a time. I did an initial and a follow-up recruitment emails. So I just sent 2 emails total. If they didn't reply, I moved on to the next person. So I did get 33 participants from 27 different institutions. So there were a few that were from the same, but it was pretty diverse in terms of institution. And they were from all over the country because I did do Skype and phone interviews primarily. Only did 1 or 2 in person. So it was mostly not in person. So this is a breakdown of the participants. It was a pretty even split, which just thankfully worked out that way, that as I was getting the participants to say yes, it kind of broke down like that. I did have 9 deans total, which I was really happy about, and then some chairs and directors and a vice chancellor, and that's a pretty even split too. I had 9 international women from 7 different countries, 1 African American woman, 1 Asian American woman. That's not a lot of diversity in terms of most of the people in the study were white women, and that is something that I wanted it to be a more diverse sample. If I did a future study, I would try to be more strategic about contacting organizations like NSBE or SHEP or certain engineering or national organizations that could get diverse participants. But I really was going for the positional leadership titles, so I was looking on websites for people that fit the criteria of being a dean, a chair, a director of a program in a department, so they had to fit that role. So sometimes when I asked people for, do you have any people, friends or colleagues you could recruit for this, and they would give me some names, but then I would go and check and they didn't always fit the criteria. So I didn't really get any people from snowball sampling, even though I did ask, and some people offered, but they often were outside of academia or they weren't in one of these positions. So I didn't end up using recommendations for that. For data collection and analysis, I did 33 individual interviews, which were about 1 hour. Some were a little less, some were more. I also collected documents from each of those participants to do a document analysis. So I did their CV for each person, a personal and internal document, and external. So the personal documents could be transcripts of speeches they gave. I got notes from leadership coaching and events from some of the women, their personal notes. I had one woman's blog posts, and then like published autobiographies or biographies that might be in the beginning of a textbook article or something like that. So it was something they wrote. And then internal documents were much easier to get because those were like internal reports or annual reports, strategic plans. So those were things that they didn't necessarily have online, but they had written because they were required to write that each year. So that was kind of to provide insight into their job role and the environment they were in. And then external documents were also pretty easy to find, even if they didn't provide those themselves. That could be a university press release that was about their accomplishments as a faculty, as a leader, the school or department newsletter, and then our department website or brochure. So I would always try to look for those resources prior to interviewing them, because sometimes there would be a past interview already done or like a YouTube video of them talking about their department. So that was very helpful, and before doing the interview to look for those things. I pulled out a couple codes that I used. I don't know if I talked about this, but I used open coding that was inductive and data driven, so codes that came from my actual data, and then deductive coding, which was concept driven from the literature and from Acker's theory. So I had a combination of both of those ways to code, and so these are some of the codes: masculinist culture, old boys club, gender leadership, gender-neutral leadership, confidence, mentoring. So I did look for Acker's theory and applying that as I was coding it, but then I also just looked for things as they came up and then used those codes moving forward. So I'm going to move on to my findings. So this is an overall summary of my findings. Both women in both disciplines, in engineering and biology, experience a masculinist culture. They all said they had, which all 33 participants. Women in both disciplines adopted gender leadership styles, and then women in both disciplines also adopted gender-neutral narratives. So there was a mix between both disciplines and those styles, which I'll get into. So, as I said, all 33 participants discussed experiences with a masculinist culture. Half of those said that they had experienced the Old Boys Club. It likely was more than that, but that was what I coded for. The Old Boys Club is typically an all-male network that limits women from getting information that they might need to advance. So these are some quotes that I pulled out of women in both disciplines talking about how they weren't invited to join in experiences with men. And this other woman is talking about how one of her women peers wouldn't stand up to the men in a tenure decision because they would lose respect for her because of the Old Boys Club. So this part of this culture included being criticized and having their research challenged, being excluded from socializing, or if you did go to an event, you would be the only woman at the event. Men not feeling comfortable being around women, men advocating for other men, but then also advocating for themselves. So one woman talked about how she was equally qualified as her peer, that was a man, and they both were eligible for tenure, but because he went around the halls talking about his accomplishments, he was being considered and she was not, and she thought that there should be plans in place to equally consider people at the same cohort level, and not just because you talked about things and promoted yourself would you have that consideration. And then not being able to speak up at meetings and treated as a note-taker or being ignored. This surprisingly happened at all levels. So even current women in leadership positions who were interviewing a candidate for a position, one woman said that she was never introduced in the beginning of the interview, and because she was taking notes, she thought that the person being interviewed assumed that she was the note-taker the whole time and didn't know who she was. And she was not asking the questions, so they were deferring to the man who was conducting the interview. So that was an example of a high-level leader who still had experienced this treatment in her current position. And then women were criticized for being too argumentative or aggressive at times. That was part of the culture. And then 1/3 of women experienced a lack of support from other women as well. And I have a quote about one woman said that another woman started going after her, and she experienced harassment, which was a really awful situation. Men didn't want to talk to me, and female faculty were harassing me, so I left. That was a situation where there was competition. This woman felt maybe threatened. She had been the only woman, then this new person came in, and felt threatened by that. That was one example of that. And this was a different example that I had, that second quote. One woman in engineering noted that it is still some ways, quote unquote, a man's world, and we have to learn how to deal with it. And so I think that some women aligned themselves with men when it came to tenure decisions in order to maintain solidarity with men and not be attacked themselves. So they kind of did that strategically, possibly to fit into that culture. 1/3 of women also experience imposter syndrome, I talked about that in the literature. One woman said, "Of course I suffer horribly from the poser syndrome. I know that any second the science police are going to come in and knock on my door and say, 'Okay, we're here for you now. We know you're a fraud and we're coming to get you now.'" And I like that quote because this woman was so funny. She had a great interview. I profile her in the first part of my chapter 4. But she was an associate dean, and she had achieved so much in her research career, but she still had experienced that imposter syndrome of not feeling like she was qualified enough, which stemmed from many years of being the outsider in her field and experiencing people that were believing that she was not good enough. So even though she knew that she had achieved a lot and she knew that she inspired other women and mentored many women, she still did have that sentiment that of imposter syndrome. So despite all of that masculinist culture that all the participants experienced, there was this idea of gender-neutral leadership for more women in engineering than biology, but they wanted to maintain a gender-neutral narrative of no difference between men and women. So women leaders did not want to generalize about men and women's characteristics and hope that there were no gender differences in leadership skills that were needed to be a successful leader. So when I asked, what skills do you think women need to be successful leaders, a lot of them were reticent to say specific advice. They said, "I'm trying to pull away from women-specific advice. I feel there's too much of a wedge that's between male and female colleagues, and I don't want to play into that." And then some others said, "I honestly don't think the skills of being a good leader differ between men and women. I would hate to think there are certain qualities that make men better or women better. I think I have stopped trying to generalize about men and women's characteristics, but I will say, if it's a male or female thing or not, I am a much better communicator than my colleagues, and that's because I've learned how to have a direct conversation with people, and I've learned not to take things personally." So I think that last quote is very indicative of the fact that even though they're saying there should be no differences in the skills that are needed, there are differences because of the treatment that women experience. So I think in an ideal world, they want to believe that men and women need the same skills and they should have the same qualities of being a leader. But then they do have to learn how to fit into a culture where direct conversation is valued or where they're tough and they don't take things personally. So it's kind of, I think, a challenge that they're struggling in between what they hope things will be and what things currently are in their discipline. But these are the traits that they identified that all leaders should have, regardless of if they were men or women, that the identity of being a scientist and a researcher was important, that they should be data-driven, consistent, transparent, decisive, visionary, and good communicators. So that was in response to how would you describe a good leader in your discipline. We also had some participants who spoke about a non-personal, data-driven style of leadership, and these were more so engineering women who said they wanted a style that was not personal, driven by strategy and data. And part of the reason I think for this is because they felt that if they showed personal, they felt that if they were too personal, it would show bias in decisions. So the second quote says, "I cannot let my personal bias get in the way of doing the right thing. But on the other hand, my personal experiences probably do give me empathy with things that other people are going through." So being data-driven and problem-solving was a big part of the engineering identity, but also a larger academic cultural identity. And I think this was something they aspired to, but it was more difficult to actually achieve, to be non-personal. Being data-driven is not hard to be in the sciences, but to balancing that with other qualities of being empathetic, which I'm going to get into, was what they kind of struggled with. One woman in engineering said, "Coming from an engineering discipline, I think I've learned that problem solving, which has helped me as a leader, but being a mother with 2 kids, I think has given me empathy with what other people are going through. But I don't ever talk about it around people, really." And I thought the last part of that quote was very telling, that she was very open with me in the interview about talking about her experiences, and she did serve on gender equity review committees, and she did work towards things, but she, on a personal level, didn't feel like she could talk about her personal experiences with people she mentored, whether faculty or students. So part of the engineering culture was preventing her from being able to be open about that aspect of her identity. And women in engineering worried that showing empathy might be seen as bias, that they would be judged more harsher than men. But I also found that empathetic leadership was a style that 1/3 of the participants embodied. And this was more women in biology than engineering were able to adopt this style. This style was a leadership style showing care and concern for others, and it basically valued connections with people and inclusivity. One person said, "If we have empathetic leaders at high level leadership, we're going to start making better decisions around the things that really matter, like inclusivity. And that's not just nice, but that's how we're going to do well in higher education." And another said, "Good leaders have to be good people," meaning moral people, honest people, caring people. They have to have soft sides. And then I have 2 other quotes on here about empathy is super lacking in our society. That person wanted to be an empathetic leader for her students and for her faculty and for the people that she led in a professional sense, but also as a mother for her daughter, because she felt that the world was becoming increasingly hostile to women and minorities, and she felt in her role as a parent that showing empathy would be being a role model to her daughter as well. So she spoke about that. Showing empathy meant that women leaders considered the challenges of their faculty and students faced in their lives and used this as a context for making leadership decisions. And then I have 2 quotes about, one woman said, "I think that women are empathetic, and this ability to see situations from many different perspectives is very valuable in a leadership role. Good leaders are respected in research, but also in how they treat others, and that's very important to me." So these women really felt that including empathy in your leadership style was important, and that they would demonstrate this to the people in their departments, whether students, faculty, staff. But there was a challenge of balancing empathy with data-driven leadership. As I said, balancing the idea of being a rational scientist that is good at problem solving with care and concern for others was problematic for some women in engineering. They worried that if they were too empathetic, they would be perceived negatively or weak. They wouldn't be demonstrating enough strength in their discipline and might be looked down upon. So one woman said, "I would say as an important public leadership skill, not being overly compassionate or empathetic, but still being human." And that I felt was representative of the fact that she could be a certain way among the students in her lab that she led, or her graduate students that she mentored, but in a meeting with other faculty and leaders, she felt like she had to be more aggressive and not show that softer, compassionate side. So she kind of felt like that was the evil that she needed to get to do in order to get ahead and make cultural change. And I think that's sad. I mean, I think she felt that was sad as well, that like she knew that she was acting different ways in different contexts, but that was a strategic thing that she did in order to advance and get tenure and be a leader, that she had different ways of acting in different spaces. Some women wanted to maintain an emotional distance from other students, saying that they didn't want to get caught up in their lives. So I think they felt like an internal struggle of they want to help their students and show that they're empathetic, but they don't want to be perceived negatively for doing so. So that was a challenge for some participants in balancing those two styles. I also found that collaborative and empowering leadership was a style that was present among 15 women. Nearly all of the women in biology identified empowerment as an important trait of a leader, while only half of women in engineering identified that as an important trait. So what I mean by empowerment is helping those below you succeed, valuing their ideas, not micromanaging them, kind of giving them the ability to work on things themselves and find out what they're good at, motivating them to be better people. So women felt unheard because they had these gendered experiences of feeling unheard or their input not being sought by others, not experiencing transparent processes like in tenure and in promotion and tenure. They developed this gendered leadership style of being collaborative and empowering, so in a response to the experiences that they had. So some of these experiences included being in a hypervigilant, very authoritative style lab, or a lab that was run by like a boot camp. And so like because they had those experiences, they didn't want to impart those on the people that they were leading. So they aspired to be different than the culture that they had come up in. One woman said, "I had a bad boss who was always looking out for himself. We were there to serve him, and he didn't always treat me with respect and tried to make the power hierarchy obvious all the time." She aspired to be the good boss and to empower others. Collaborative leadership builds on community and inclusivity and making people feel comfortable and valued. So listening to others, encouraging them to speak, empowering them to lead, not micromanaging. Those are things that women aspired to do in their leadership. These women drew from their experiences in a masculinist culture of competition, aggressiveness, and hierarchy and silencing to counteract these negative experiences with that leadership style. So I'm going to look at one of my research questions, research question number 3, how do gendered experiences inform women leaders' leadership expectations, and look at how Acker's theory might be applied to that, answering that question. So Acker's theory looks at gender divisions, and I'm looking at the gendered leadership style first, and then I'm going to look at gender-neutral leadership style and move through the theory. So women experienced harsher judgment than men in terms of their leadership behaviors. So that was a division between men and women. One woman said, "I'm in a man's world, but I can't behave like a man." Examples of this would be that women are called a bitch if they're aggressive, or even if they're not aggressive, but even if they're just stating their opinion in a meeting, and they could be perceived as confrontational when men are valued as good leaders for that same behavior. So one woman said that, what is the saying? A woman is, I don't want to say it's a bad word, a biatch, but a man is a strong leader. So that symbol of being a bitch basically was something that the women felt they had to navigate in the culture, that they had to have a delicate balance of showing enough aggression and strength to be accepted but not showing too much, that they would be perceived negatively. And that was something that their men peers did not have to negotiate. So some examples of gendered interactions that they experienced is, as I touched on briefly before, would being unheard, unrecognized, unmentored, micromanaged, and challenged. And these experiences that they had enforced women's marginalized status within their department, and expectations between men and women. So having those experiences caused them to feel that they needed to alter their behavior and their identity, which is the next one, gendered individual identity. So nearly 3/4 of the women spoke about how their identity was shaped by their gendered experiences. All but 2 of the women in biology and all but 6 of the women in engineering had experiences that they had to modify their behavior in order to fit into a masculinist culture. And so that could be taking on a softer approach, a mellower approach, and basically some women talked about using the tactic of smiling in negotiations to get what they wanted, even if it was a negotiation with a dean who was a female dean, or a superior who was a woman, but they felt that that people responded better to them if they softened their approach and were, as one woman described, persistently pleasant. They said you have to do it with a smile on your face to avoid negative reactions. One woman said that she changed her language in meetings to be less confrontational by saying, "Oh, that is very nice, but in my opinion, it could be different." So instead of just saying, "I have a different opinion," like she had to kind of say it in a certain way, because that specific woman said that she did not get as big of a raise as she had in past years, and when she went to her superior to ask that, they said that, "Oh, it's because you spoke back to that person in the meeting," and then obviously she was challenged. She challenged that and negotiated for a higher raise, but that was the reason given, was because you challenged someone that was an important person, and you need to not speak up from now on. And like, this is like,
It's not even subtle, is it?
it like wasn't subtle.
I'm surprised I would say that. I give that reason. Yeah.
Because you could sue someone over. I don't know why you'd say that, but yeah, like those are like extreme examples. I mean, I feel like that's extreme to think that is actually happening now with these women that are like making breakthrough discoveries in engineering and biology and like doing these amazing things that are saving the world, but then in their own department they're treated poorly for just trying to make a point in a meeting. So that those were some of the experiences of like trying to negotiate how to get people to listen to you favorably by modifying their behavior. So the organizational logic was that you have to fit into the overall culture first before changing it. So as I talked about before, like negotiating how to not be too empathetic or too compassionate, or picking the spaces that you show those behaviors in order to succeed. So I think it was not that they couldn't have gendered leadership. They could be empathetic leaders, but they had to temper that and not be too empathetic. Or they could be collaborative leaders if it was valued by their discipline, but they still had to fit in other ways. So in looking at gender-neutral leadership, women were seen as the exception, especially in fields like engineering where there were less women, the outsider in their discipline. So men were perceived as being the scientists or the gender-neutral norm for which others were judged. So to be an engineer was to be a man, but women were women engineers, not just an engineer, or women scientists, not a neuroscientist. One woman said she was called she kind of called herself this, but the queen of the tundra, because she was, when she was a field scientist, like that was her label. And then another woman was negatively called a groupie, young in her early career, because when she went to present at a conference, and she did really well, when she was returning on the bus with all of her peers, they said, "Oh, I just thought you were so and so's boyfriend. Like I never knew you were like even in our department or qualified to give such a presentation." And they were impressed. So maybe it was a backhanded compliment, but basically they were just saying like, "I thought you just hung out with us because the person you're with is in our department." But that was an example of a label that that a woman had earlier in her career. So these divisions between men and women could be represented in the symbol of being the only women serving on every committee, having more gendered workload as far as representing your gender on equity committees or promotion and tenure committees, faculty hiring committees, and it being excluded from the old boys club and experiencing isolation. Interactions with men that produce gendered social structures could be seen in research collaborations. So one woman said that I've had a lot of collaborations where I'm on the paper, but I don't even get asked to review the paper before it goes out. Then on the other end of the spectrum, I've had collaborators who are constantly bringing up if I feel included, if they want me to feel included. They're aware of issues with men and women, male and female dynamics, but they bring them up so often it's annoying because I just want to be a scientist. So this idea of like just wanting to be a scientist, not a female scientist, not a woman scientist, not always that extra, but to be the norm instead of the outsider. And that came out in collaborations that they had with their male peers, like in research and on papers and things like that. And so that shaped their gendered individual identity because they learned that they had to toughen up and have a thick skin and exhibit strength, not show emotion, be assertive in order to succeed. So equal numbers of women in each discipline felt that they needed to be tough, thick-skinned, persistent. One woman provided the advice, you have to be tough, there's no question about it. You have to have a thick skin and let unimportant things roll off your back. So they kind of, over time, as they existed in their disciplines, realized to be successful, they had to distance themselves from emotions at times, or they had to be tough in order to withstand criticism they were experiencing. And then for organizational logic, women were perceived as being good communicators and problem solvers, but because they were perceived as this, they were seen as being responsible for getting out of bad collaborations with men and for choosing the right men. This is what one woman said, is that, well, I think you have to choose the right men to collaborate with. And to get out of those bad relationships, they question whether they could have done things differently or changed their behavior rather than having men change their behavior. So I guess the idea that it is their personal responsibility to change things and not the men's responsibility. But this kind of plays into the idea that they reframed these bad collaborations as just gender-neutral errors in communication or human misunderstandings. So instead of saying, like, this is gendered treatment, they would say, well, sometimes women treat me badly and sometimes men treat me badly. It's just personalities, and I don't gel with this person like I gel with the other person, so I'm going to avoid working with them in the future, which could be the case. But it also could make them feel better to have that explanation that it was just a specific person they had a problem with, not because he was male. Maybe he had a history of being like that with everyone, but they were just judging it on an individual basis, saying, I can learn how to resolve this. Like, I'm a problem solver. This kind of came into play with like an engineering identity of, I'm a problem solver, I'm an engineer, I can like engineer my way out of this and develop solutions. So I did see that as an explanation of how women didn't feel like it was necessarily the organization's responsibility, but it was their responsibility to fix these problems that they had with their coworkers or in collaborations. So, in conclusion, though the cultures may be changing, I don't think engineering is changing as quickly as biology. But women in biology did say that it is a discipline that values collaboration and it's less aggressive and less competitive than when they started as a postdoc many years before. So they described it as more welcoming and a friendly field. So I think there was some hope in that biology, it does have more women to begin with, but because of that, possibly it's becoming more accepting. Engineering still has few women, and the women in this study did adopt gender-neutral, data-driven, not personal styles of leadership because they didn't want to be perceived as being biased. So, while women leaders in biology were able to push back against a masculinist culture by using their gendered experiences in their leadership, women in engineering were more restricted from fully embracing empathy and empowerment by fears of being perceived as biased and desires to uphold gender neutrality and maintain solidarity with men. But I don't know if I'm good on time, but I want to leave you with a positive quote from a woman in engineering. She said, sure, there's a little bit of that you need a thick skin, and there's no reason you should have to put up with stuff that you need a thick skin for. I think that part of changing the culture in the university is one of these myths that just propagates. If you just have all these junior people toughening up and thickening up so that they can stand the nasty culture, then you're never going to change the culture. So I think she recognized that she had to change who she was, but she was hopeful that others would not have to go through that she still did feel she had to be tough. She felt that she couldn't talk about her experiences with her students, but she was hopeful that others would be able to be more open about those experiences. I do have 2 more slides. So these are my policy and practice recommendations. That there would be more women mentors, which is difficult because if you don't have women faculty in your department, how can you have women mentors? And that was a struggle for a lot of women, but they looked to women outside of their institution or outside of their department at least, in larger disciplinary groups and networking settings, and kind of assembled their own network of women that could be a support for them. So throughout the years, women that had been in graduate school with them, they kept in touch with and formed these networks for themselves because they were not always provided to them. But I guess I'm recommending that women are assigned a women mentor, even if it is not someone in their same department, but in a closely related department or within their school, to have that mentorship available to them, to kind of counteract the effects of the old boys club and all male networks, to make sure that they have access to the information that they need to advance to the next level. Leadership programs, some women did talk about leadership programs they had in their institutions that were not necessarily for women in STEM, but were for open to any women in any discipline, and that was nice because they were able to come together as a cohort and start a leadership program together in a formal setting. So one of the women leaders was in her first year of starting this cohort program, and she was really excited about that. But there were a lot of situations of informal groups of women getting together at someone's house, just to talk about issues or reading like an article each week and discussing it. I think formal leadership programs are important though in institutions, whether it's like human resources that provides that or a school that provides that for their faculty, so that so women can identify what their own leadership style is and kind of explore that throughout their career. And then I think that, some women said is that at different stages of your career, you need different leadership training. So you don't always know what it means to be a leader when you first start, but as you go on, there's more specific things that you would benefit from. So I didn't specifically look at distinguishing leaders in my study by the level that they were at, but that could be something for a future study. But I think like leadership programs should address that not all leaders are on the same level. They could be early leaders, late leaders. They might need different support, but if they're all together, then they can benefit from sharing their experiences. Gender equity review is important, I think, for a university to have on a university-wide scale or a school-wide scale or departmental scale. Some women did talk about doing that within their own departments. They did like a matrix or a breakdown of everyone's workload to see were there people serving on more committees than others, and like how do they balance that. So some of them actually had tools or spreadsheets that they used within their department to kind of assess that things were being divided fairly through workload, which is just one example, or doing some sort of a campus climate survey or departmental climate survey to assess how welcoming the department is. But gender equity review could pertain to hiring faculty, making sure those processes are transparent and equitable, and a lot of other different topics. Gender bias and sexual harassment training. I mean, I just took that through UB. I was required by my department to take it, and I know it's a New York State mandate because my boyfriend just took that in his work as well. And I think his work would be described as a masculinist culture because he works in like for a lumber company where there is primarily men. But I think even in his company, like it allows conversations to happen, even if not in the workplace setting, but then all of those people go home and they say, I had to take this training, and then they like start talking about it. So I think it at least opens up opportunities for future engagement around that. So I think having mandatory, this is the thing that a lot of universities are doing, but gender bias and sexual harassment training that's mandatory for faculty specifically, and for leaders, I think is very important. For future research, I did speak about this, trying to find ways to recruit a diverse sample in terms of race and ethnicity. Could be another study to address those issues. Looking at different sites for research, so I did research institutions, and you also could interview women in private colleges or community colleges, so you could do the same type of study with women in engineering and biology, but in a different university type, and that might speak to different institutional cultures and how that influences things. You could also look at different groups, so like I did women in biology and engineering, but there are more women in chemistry and there's less women in physics, so that's kind of, you could do the setup with chemistry and physics instead of biology and engineering and see if that produced a similar findings. And as I talked about before, doing a study with early, mid, and late career leaders could be really interesting to see how leadership expectations change at different levels.
Interesting. And that's the last point too, isn't it? Longitudinal.
Yeah, that would be if you're tracking the same leaders and how their perceptions change over time. Like if I did a follow-up in 3 or 4 or 5 years with these or other leaders, then you could see, are you in a different space than you were at that time? And then some of the women themselves said, like, I think I'm this sort of leader, but you'd have to ask my coworkers if they feel the same way. So there's always that challenge of like, this is how they perceive themselves, that's how they're answering the question, but I'm not asking their peers or their direct reports. So that's another interesting way to do this, would be doing more interviews with others that could speak to their leadership style. So like, how do others perceive them to be? Like, they're perceiving themselves to be a certain way, but how do others see that?
Well, Rebecca, I
Yeah.
want to have time for question and answer because some people may need to leave, but that was absolutely terrific, and the overview you gave, so thank you very much. I'm going to take some questions. Anyone with questions, comments, points of clarification?
Oh, I have so many questions.
I know.
I will probably follow
I
up
have
with you in an email at some point because I don't want to dominate discussion. But one thing that, you know, we see, and I don't know, when did you do the interviews? Because I know you've been writing for a long time. Like, what year or months were the interviews taking place?
So they were last year.
Okay.
I hope I'm getting this right. Yeah, I did the interviews, I started them in like January, and then
Okay.
I finished them in July.
Okay.
So, and there was only like one or two in like in the summer. It was more so in like during that spring semester, and then I finished up, this was last year, in July, and then I did transcriptions that fall. And then this year I've been working on chapter 4 and 5. So
Yeah.
it was like about a little over a year ago.
Because one thing that I find interesting is all the studies now about how men are scared of mentoring women and being alone with women in professional spaces.
Yeah.
And if any of that came up in any of your research interviews with like post Me Too and things like that, where women's opportunities are in fact shrinking professionally because men are scared down the line that they'll get accused of something.
There was one woman who was a recent new head of her department, and when she would go out with she said, like her superior, I don't remember what the title was, like would take all of the other heads out to lunch but her. And she felt that, I mean, she didn't know for sure, but she felt like he felt uncomfortable being in a personal setting with her as a woman. And that was her perception of what could be the reason. But she said that there is a climate of like, people are afraid to do anything because they could be accused of something. So one participant did talk about that. I did talk about the Me Too movement with another participant too, that she thought that was interesting that I was doing this as these things were coming out in the news.
Just let me interject, Liesl Folks in her last event here, it was a terrific event in the Student Union Theater, and one graduate student, a female graduate student, engineering, said, my advisor's taking out all the male cohort except me because he's scared in the wake of Me Too of what to do. That's okay, you don't need to. It's not my best side. And Liesl had a great response. She said, it's very easy. You know, just tell your advisor, don't say stupid things and keep your hands to yourself. And that's it. So I thought she's not here, so I thought I'd throw that out because I think it was really good advice.
Yeah. So I'm sure there was other examples of that as well, but that was the one that I thought of that someone had talked about, like a fear of interacting or being more standoffish. And that is why maybe some women felt more isolated from men, is because they just avoided them completely.
You know, you mentioned something at the beginning that there's more female undergraduates in biology than in engineering. And I was wondering if you could come back to it now and say, to what extent is the leadership style friendlier, to use your word, at the end, in biology, precisely because the students are primarily women? And so to what extent is it sort of organic? It's sort of a bottom-up influence where if the student body is already women and women-identified people, then does that change the culture of leadership?
I do think that is a factor because of having more women students in the field may attract more women faculty to be in that field, and the opposite as well. So I think like that's why I wanted to look at engineering and biology as a comparison, that there's one is considered to be female dominated, even though departments don't often have more female faculty than men in biology, but the students there are more female students. So I think that that does lend itself to like the nature of a changing field, that like when women came in the 70s and 80s, some of these senior women, it was not that way, that they still were the one woman student, the one woman faculty, and that like when I asked them questions about their interactions, or when I asked them questions, they would say like I was the only woman, that was just my experience. So but I think that is changing now. So I do think that helps the fields be more open to these styles of leadership. Like one woman spoke about how biology is becoming more collaborative and that being valued for that. So like she spoke about how like when she was a grad student, everyone was in their office with closed doors, and now they have these collaborative spaces where all the students work together. And so that she thought collaboration was valued overall in the discipline, and that was helping collaborative leaders be valued as well. So I do think that change or that difference in how many women are in the field is helpful in enacting certain leadership styles.